everyone. We'll be starting shortly. I would love if y'all would like to chat in these check-in questions. We have introduce yourself with your name, location, organization, pronouns, and how have you been practicing self-care recently? Be starting in just another minute, just letting people trickle in a little longer. All right, well, let's get started. Thank you for those who are checking in. Still feel free to keep checking in if you're dropping in. We just would love for you to introduce yourself and give a little way you've been practicing self-care recently. Okay. Today's Lunch and Learn will be around self-care and privilege during the COVID-19 pandemic. Really excited to be having this conversation on how these two intersect. Okay. My name is Ashton Polanco. I'm a manager here at ProInspire. I felt that this was really an important discussion to be had. At first, I was just supposed to be leading a lunch and learn on self-care practices and what we can be doing around that. And then I kind of kept rubbing me the wrong way. And I realized it's because there was this piece that was not getting talked about. And I think that was what kept coming up to me, is that I was like, well, yeah, I have the time right now to be doing self-care, and I have the resources because I'm a full-time salaried employee, and I can work from home now. I don't have any kids, and I have plenty of time. But what kept coming to my mind are some people that, as we're thinking about essential workers and other people that are not able to work remotely, who might not have this access to time and resources, and that self-care really needed to be presented differently. What I kept seeing in mainstream self-care practices was just something that I didn't see as, a one-size-fits-all for everyone. So that's when I looked into self-care and privilege, and I came upon Michelle's Goodlow's blog, who I'm very excited to introduce. She is our guest today. She's the founder of gmichelle.com, and she's a licensed therapist in Atlanta, Georgia. She covers a variety of topics around self-care, and she really brings in an equity lens to her blogs, which I really appreciated, because that was something that I really thought was important when we're talking about having these conversations, and things that were really getting unraveled as we continue through this pandemic, and really continue to see that there are inequities and that there are people that are experiencing different things. So I would love to open it up to Michelle to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Ashlyn and the ProInspire team, thank you so much for having me and for finding me to talk about this really important topic. I think talking about self-care, especially for folks in nonprofits who hold leadership positions, frontline positions, it's so important for us to kind of unravel some of the tightly knit things that come up when talking about privilege and self-care. So we are definitely going to do that today. I'm really excited to be here with you all.
Great, thank you. Go to the next slide. Okay. Michelle, I'll open it up to you to discuss a little bit the differences between self-care and self-care practices.
Yeah. So there are a ton of different definitions for self-care, and there isn't a one-size-fit-all definition. This is the one that just resonates with me the most. Doing what you need to do to show up as your best self is basically what self-care is. Trying your best to do different practices, different habits that help you really show up to be the best version of yourself is really what self-care is all about. And I talk a lot about this with clients and different folks who are interested in self-care. Sometimes it helps to work backwards. Like, think about the time where you were showing up as your best self, when you were doing your best work or fulfilling a role in your life that's really important to you. What all was going on to help you do that? So starting with that and then working backwards helps you develop some self-care ideas. And there's a good chance you've already been practicing self-care already. A couple of examples we have here are really, really pertaining to the stay-at-home orders that we're all kind of abiding by. Taking like 15 minutes to go outside, get some fresh air, get some sunshine, in between the virtual meetings that you have, or listening to some of your favorite songs to help boost your mood. And Ashlyn and I were talking about this a little bit, having like a mood playlist. Like, if you're in a funk and there's certain songs that help you get out of that funk, create a playlist of those songs and play them. Be aware that something's coming up for you in terms of a funky mood and put that playlist on. Again, these are practices that help you show up as your best self. And when we look at the actual self-care practice, this is the actual routine that you have in place to practice self-care. So you can do a one-off self-care every once in a while, but self-care practice means you're doing something routinely so that you're showing up as your best self. You're not just identifying your needs, but you're also addressing those needs on a regular basis. So the example we have here is doing a weekly journal to kind of write about where you are this week and what's changed and what your needs are. I know for myself, lately, as I think we've been sheltered in place for 2 months now, I've had to really get really disciplined about my morning routine. I've got to do something to take care of my physical body, whether that be exercising, stretching, something to get it moving and engaged. I have got to make breakfast for myself, can't skip breakfast. It is the most important meal of the day. Got to make sure I eat something healthy for myself. And then I noticed lately it's been important for me to journal in the morning. Sometimes you wake up and you have all these different thoughts. Sometimes I need to just get it out and help organize myself so I can show up as my best self for the rest of the day. So that's self-care and self-care practice.
Great, thank you so much, Michelle. Also, I do want to mention, we are recording this webinar. If you don't feel comfortable with having anything shared, if you're going to speak later on, then please just feel free to email me. I'll be sharing my contact information at the end. So yeah, next slide will be on benefits of adopting a self-care practice. So here are a few that I have lined out that have, been coming up for me. So it helps you build a stronger mind and body. It allows you to set boundaries and create healthy relationships with others. It increases your self-awareness. It increases your understanding and ability to process emotions. And I think we can all understand that there's a lot of emotions that come up, especially right now. I think more than ever, there's times where I just feel like, I need to like just cry it out, cry about what's happening, or, process grief. It helps you become better positioned to take care of others. I think that's a really important point. I think with self-care, it's really difficult for some people to put their needs before the needs of others, especially for caregivers. I think that this is the importance of self-care, of understanding that it is really important to, when doing the self-awareness, to address what your needs are, because it helps you become better positioned to take care of those that you're working with. It allows you to show up better, and it really just it helps promote those feelings. It helps with creating less burnout and fatigue, which just increases your productivity. I think we can all understand what the Zoom, back-to-back Zoom virtual meetings have done to us, has created a different type of fatigue that I even know existed. And it seems like right now, when we think we have so much extra time, it sometimes seems like I feel like there's been an increase in workload and an increase in so this helps with mitigating some of the fatigue that we're feeling right now. And truly, the best benefits of adopting a self-care practice are anything that you really helps you feel better supported, helps you feel better supported to take on your day-to-day tasks. Michelle, do you have any other pieces to add to this?
You just see me nodding ferociously in my little screen, because this is so true. And I want to add that we emphasize the difference between self-care and a self-care practice, especially for folks who are caregivers, nurturers, working in nonprofit work as helpers, because when tough situations come up, like what we're dealing with now, having a self-care practice that you've already been doing on a consistent basis helps us cope. No self-care practice is perfect, and self-care practices evolve and change like we do. But when you're in the practice of taking care of yourself, and emphasizing what Ashlyn said, taking care of yourself first, right? Because if we aren't there to show up, then nobody gets helped. We have to make sure we're taking care of ourselves. It helps us cope with these adversities that often come up in the work that we do.
Great, thank you so much, Michelle. So here we have a little of our fun Venn diagram and the very beautiful ProInspire colors between privilege and self-care. So to go through privilege, when you Google define privilege, it comes up as a special right, advantage, or immunity granted. It's available only to a particular person or group of people. So some forms of privilege that have been coming up that I've been seeing a lot in mainstream self-care practices are white privilege, socioeconomic class privilege, ability privilege, and language privilege. So those are just a few, but I think my mind always goes to a white woman doing yoga, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. But there are these, when that is an image you constantly see in mainstream self-care practices, then that can also be a barrier to access for others. Being disadvantaged in some areas does not make you immune to having privileges. So I think that is a really important point to drive home, is that sometimes people feel that just because they're part of a marginalized community, and that means that they are free from having privileges, and that's just not that's not a reality. Truly, you can you can still be part of a marginalized community or be disadvantaged in some areas and still continue to hold privileges. And it's really important, I think, to do some introspective work and to look at that and instead of fearing having privilege, being okay with it and being aware and understanding, and that helps create change. So self-care during COVID-19, mainstream self-care practices most often require time and resources and ability. An example is having a fitness or meditation regimen. A lot of the ones that have been being shared, apps or instructors, even the virtual ones, still require some type of resources. Even though it's made it a little bit easier than having a gym membership, maybe they're not as expensive, it still does require some of these privileges that we see. or working with a licensed therapist. I think that assumes that you have medical coverage or to help with those costs. And still there's still other costs that come up with that. It does take time to go see somebody regularly. So often a lot of people don't have the ability to have access to working with a licensed therapist. And particularly with some of these marginalized communities, we see them being the ones who really are in need of this and still don't have the access to this. Self-care requires stability, whether that be physical, financial, mental, or emotional. It requires access to knowledge about practices. I think that's like something that I've seen is a lot of self-care practices are being shared kind of in one way, and that might not be a way that everyone can access, especially like those who have historically not had knowledge about self-care. It's a pretty like new trendy thing that's been kind of coming up a lot, but the benefits are really important and something that everyone should really have access to be able to do. Our identities and lived experiences shape our self-care needs during the pandemic. And then in between, I have inability to access self-care practices that are being shared, kind of goes with what I was saying before this, and thinking about essential workers who are currently unable to work remotely and who we see filling these roles and how sometimes they, like I mentioned, don't have as many resources. They don't have healthcare or paid sick leave or paid time off. A lot of the things that I've seen, the benefits I've seen of being a full-time salaried worker, of getting to work remotely is just truly has opened up the access that I have into these self-care practices that I don't see amongst other groups. And Michelle, do you have anything to add on this?
I do, Ashlyn. I was actually kind of checking out the really important kind of pieces folks are touching on in the chat room.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of further talking about privilege, and especially at this particular time. There are a lot of different folks who have been practicing self-care. They just haven't been calling it that, right? And when we talk about these different forms of privilege, we also have to recognize that the stay-at-home order really impacts a lot of different families and individuals in so many different ways. While there's kind of this notion, especially that I see on social media, that, oh, I have more time to do A, B, and C, a lot of families and individuals actually have had an increase in responsibilities and tasks related to running their household and working full-time still. And one thing that we really want to emphasize is the impact of compassion fatigue on professional helpers. I love the word compassion. A definition of compassion is kind of looking at suffering and being with someone in suffering and witnessing that and wanting to do something different to help them. And of course, when we talk about fatigue, that extreme exhaustion and feeling tired, a lot of professional helpers, especially in nonprofits, have an increased risk of feeling this compassion fatigue. And there's so many different things to do about that. One of the first being, is there a way for me to meet my physical needs at the very basic level? Is there a way for me to meet my physical needs? Meaning, can I get enough water in the day? Is there a way for me to get some quality sleep, right? Am I eating enough during the day, and especially eating nourishing foods? Do I have access to those nourishing foods to eat? We really are thinking about basic levels of just having that physical care, which is so important. We can definitely talk about this more, but specifically for folks who are professional helpers, you want to be mindful of that compassion fatigue and your burnout, your levels of burnout. Again, burnout happens over an extended period of time where you're feeling a lot of exhaustion or disconnect or difficulty with doing the work that you're doing. We have to emphasize that a lot of us have never been through a pandemic before. So we are all collectively experiencing maybe some increased anxiety, some increased feelings of fear and related to this. And every individual has different accesses in terms of resources to help with coping with all of these different changes.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
Yeah.
So here I have a few little do's and don'ts that might come up. So do think about what you need to show up as your best self. Do acknowledge what privileges you might carry with you. Do consider how your self-care needs differ from others. kind of like my whole point that it's not a one size fits all, right? People are unique. And so your self-care practices really reflect an individual, what an individual has and the uniqueness that an individual carries with them. Share self-care practices that are accessible to others, and create spaces that are safe and healthy for others to participate in self-care. Don't feel too guilty to create a self-care practice. I think that it's really easy with kind of getting told that this is a privilege, that it might prevent some from wanting to partake, because we know we find that guilt starts to creep in. I want to like emphasize that is not the point, that like having privileges doesn't mean you shouldn't do them or use them. It truly just means like to acknowledge them and understand that they are there, and really try to create access for others who might not have these same privileges. So continue to find what's best for you. We've outlined some of the benefits of why it's so important to have self-care practices, what it really helps, how it can aid you to navigate during this pandemic. Don't consider only mainstream self-care practices. So not being able to see yourself in these practices can be a barrier to your self-care. Think about all the different ways that you can better take care of yourselves, and don't just assume because what's getting shared or what's really popular or what influencers are doing on Instagram is necessarily right for you. It really just varies from person to person, and could be as little as cooking a meal or cleaning up the room. Those are I think in their own way a type of self-care that can also be part of our day-to-day routines. Don't always put the needs of others before your own. This can lead to fatigue and resentment. Again, I understand this is really difficult for caretakers particularly, and may not always be an option. But we do hope that there's some importance of centering what your needs may be, and at least finding a way to talk about it, journal about it, really get some of it out there, because that can truly help a lot of this emotional and physical fatigue that we're carrying. Oh, sorry, Michelle, would you like to add anything?
Yeah. And it's important too to think about, okay, not only do I need to make sure I'm practicing self-care to show up as my best self. I know that can sometimes be really hard to even conceptualize. But what I know, especially with working with professional helpers, is what does it look like when you aren't taking the best care of yourself? How do you know that? What is your body doing? How is your mind feeling? What does your work look like? And again, I'm seeing there's so much good, rich stuff coming up in the chat. And I think I actually have an entire blog talking about guilt and self-care, because as somebody who's worked in nonprofits before, I'm telling you, guilt would come up a lot when thinking about putting my own needs in front of the people that I was working with or I was serving. And guilt, again, I love looking at definitions of words. And guilt is a feeling that's rooted in consequences. It's a conception that's rooted in consequence. We think about guilt, we think about consequence. And when you think about that in terms of self-care, when a lot of us professional folks who work in helping fields and communities, we feel guilty for taking time for ourselves instead of doing something in service for someone else. And the narrative I kind of like to rewrite for that is, when you are able to take care of yourself, you actually show up as a stronger and more helpful person. You are actually able to help more and help better if you're able to take some time to take care of yourself. Don't get me wrong. I mean, what's always a part of these conversations is how difficult that is, or that there's so much on our plates to manage. We feel guilty stepping away from that to take care of ourselves. So that's why I say there's a difference between self-care and a self-care practice. If you can only do self-care, every once in a while, that's better than nothing. And addressing that guilt, it means that we're really recognizing the consequences of not doing self-care. So again, we'll continue to have these conversations in this Lunch and Learn and beyond. I'll make sure to share with Ashlyn and the ProInspire team my particular blog on what comes up for you if guilt comes up for you when it comes to talking about self-care, and why self-care is not selfish. I'll make sure to share that. You guys have access to that one.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. That's one of my favorite ones, actually, your blog on that, and the difference between guilt and accountability.
Yes.
And I think to your point, also the importance of these boundary settings when we're talking about providing care for others and like being compassionate. Sometimes I think it's really easy to like, to constantly just give, and give. And that is in itself like a very exhausting process. So how do we set these like really helpful boundaries and having like these, forming these more powerful relationships with one another as we do provide care and, make sure that boundary setting is a way of self-care as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, it doesn't always feel like just like a really big take, maybe especially when you're not fully in the right state to be giving quite as much.
That's perfectly said.
Yeah.
Perfectly said. Yeah.
I think that's something that's come up a lot for me recently is like, sometimes I can talk to the world and sometimes it's like, okay, but just my mom today.
Yes.
That's all I can do.
That's right.
And I think that's okay. So I want to open it up to a few questions that I have for you before letting the audience, the audience can continue to chat in some questions that they may have, or we'll also have a part where we open it up and people can unmute themselves and ask the question to you live. So my first question is, how, I think we talked about this already, but how does privilege show up in the mainstream self-care practices and who is left out? Why does that matter?
We could spend the rest of the time talking about that particular question, but to be concise, I think a lot of marginalized communities, a lot of communities of color, a lot of folks who have different abilities are left out of those mainstream kind of looks and views and trends regarding self-care. There's a lot of cultural practices related to self-care that aren't necessarily mainstream, that are so important and so fulfilling to so many people. And again, specifically speaking to COVID-19, I really like to emphasize that so many families do not have the extra time or money to practice self-care, and they are having an increase in responsibilities, tasks, and expenses. I'm thinking a lot of different parents who weren't planning on budgeting for their whole family to have lunch every day in the house, and how it's difficult to talk about those resources. The increase in utility bills and grocery bills happening right now, or folks who have transitioned from working on site to working remotely. They don't have the same resources at home to do the same amount or level of work that they did if they were in the office. And what if your family member or you are struggling with having violence or abuse at home, or having a family member or a loved one who has substance abuse issues or mental health challenges, and virtual counseling is not an option for them right now? They're not a good fit for that. So again, a lot of different challenges are coming up for folks with trying to cope with staying at home that we want to be mindful of. And sometimes mainstream kind of discussions about self-care don't include that. And so a lot of communities feel left out of even being able to have the opportunity to take care of themselves.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michelle, for that. My next question is, what are the factors that we see impacting nonprofit or social impact leaders, as we like to call them sometimes, and then their need for self-care?
We definitely touched on this, that the compassion fatigue is very high amongst nonprofit leaders already before the pandemic, and now with all of the additional responsibilities of trying to transition the work that you would do in the field or at your organization or outside of the home, trying to transition that work, be productive, be effective with these new standards is a whole new level of stress for a lot of nonprofit leaders. And again, I saw something mentioned in the chat. What if you don't have the finances to, make sure that folks who are underemployed get the finances they need? What I want to offer to a lot of nonprofit leaders is hope around this. That's the first thing I want to share, is that there's a reason you're in that leadership position, and either someone chose you to be in that position or you were promoted to that position. You can be hopeful in the ability to use your power and privilege to help the folks, even if it's not financially. Is there a way for you to be flexible with work standards? Is there anything that can be taken off your plate? When working with a lot of nonprofit professionals, I see a lot of folks who aspire to do it all. I'm like, that's great. That's awesome, but we can't do all that right now. Is there a way to focus on what's important over things that are just urgent, right? Is there a way to talk to your grant funders about extending deadlines for certain projects, right? And focusing on the immediate needs right now. And we may talk about this a little later, Ashlyn, so I'm sorry for jumping ahead. But when it comes to self-care, is there a way for you to model self-care for your staff? I know when I was working as a frontline worker, as a counselor, and seeing like my supervisor or my director take a morning off to take care of themselves, or to actually stop working and have a lunch break without any distractions or devices, I remember that so clearly. It gave me permission to do the same, because folks who are on the front line are looking to leadership as a model for what to do and how to take care of themselves in this work. So if you can model self-care, that can do a world of difference for your staff and your environment. So those are some pieces that are coming up, Ashlyn, for me around this.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. And that's okay. We answered the next one in that. So I would love to like shift it over to the chat and see,
Yes.
We have one question from, I think it's important to remember that we're not working from home so much as we're trying to figure out how to do our jobs remotely in the midst of a pandemic. That underlying and stress and anxiety is huge. Could you talk a little bit about this, Michelle?
Sure. Change. What I've seen is a lot of organizations not recognizing that. They're doing the exact same work as if they were in the office and had access to all the resources. So the first thing I think could be helpful is, okay, what feels actual and factual and realistic for us to do right now, and what doesn't? And as leaders, as a leadership team, having a real discussion about that, and then bringing it to your staff and acknowledging that we are really in an uncertain time. So it's even hard for us to plan to move forward effectively sometimes with everything that's going on. So I would really take a look at what's currently on your plate in terms of project deliverables and grant deliverables. What feels like we can do this right now, and what things feel like, hey, we may have to hold this off until the end of the year, next year, however you want to create your timelines. Take a really good look at the tasks in front of you and try and organize that.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. I think somebody, Mandy was asking if you know of any organizations that are maybe modeling this well right now, or if not, particularly to point out an organization, what you see, like an ideal organization, how they would model some of this.
What a great question. I can't think of an organization off the top of my head, but I can think of some practices just from my previous experiences. Having flexibility around work hours and scheduling is something I've very specifically seen in organizations that's very effective. Having a lot of understanding for the parents, for staff, for folks who have different needs. I know Ashlyn and I have talked about, there's a lot of folks who have different identities, and we want to acknowledge those different identities and the needs that they have. So having flexibility around that is something I've seen a lot of organizations do that seems to be really helpful for staff. And having transparency around fear and uncertainty too. Again, on the opposite side, I've seen organizations that are just acting like nothing is going on. And it's very stressful for staff to continue to move, even though there's been so much change and no discussion about it. So again, leaders coming together, coming up with, okay, what do we want to make sure our staff know about these very real feelings of fear and anxiety and uncertainty that we have? How can we communicate that in a way that's effective and understanding, and then come together as a group because we're collectively going through this experience together?
I think that's a great point. Do you have any thoughts on how to communicate to leadership in these organizations when you're not seeing it being modeled quite this way?
And you're like in the position of like a frontline staff and things like that?
I think that's like an assumption. Yes, maybe you're just not like a director level, or like that it's not, maybe like the staff is feeling something, and how can you communicate that up to model more of these, understanding the importance of these?
That's such a good question, and that's a tough question. Depending on where you work, what your work culture is, and how much risk is involved with that, I want to be mindful of all of that, about those power dynamics. I will share from my own experience and experience of my colleagues, being able to have a conversation with my supervisor about that. And I love this technique. If anybody's heard of it or have used it, the compliment sandwich, or yes, no, yes, addressing something that you have a problem with in a way that helps keep the relationship secure. So all the elements of this boundary setting and tough discussion technique, all of that has to be true. But saying something like, hey, I really love working here, but I've noticed that I don't see a lot of folks practicing self-care. I'm wondering what's the culture around practicing self-care. I really would like to do that so I can show up at my job and do the best that I can. I'm wondering if there's any suggestions you have around that. And I've noticed leadership isn't doing that. Again, you can do that any way that you want to. I've noticed that structure helps. If it's hard to have those tough conversations with people who have a lot of power in your organization, I would go to the supervisor, ask if the supervisor can talk to the director, and so on, and looking at hierarchical structures. That's one option.
Yeah, that's great, Michelle. And I think I've seen this kind of popping up in a lot of these conversations we've been having with some partners, is that sometimes they're in giving so much care, especially right now with communities that really, like the communities that they work with that are being impacted at such a quick and just like really just negatively impacting them really quickly. That sometimes like this care is being given, but sometimes like it gets lost within staff. And I think that's like sometimes within like nonprofit organizations, like it's easier to like, okay, the communities obviously are in such need, but not addressing some of the needs of their own, like what their staff members are going through, and just addressing the actual like nature of what this pandemic is doing to people, how it is affecting, and how like, productivity hasn't really ceased all the time. Like it just, like I mentioned, it almost worse. Yeah. None of the very real feelings in the nonprofit sectors of like being overworked, and how sometimes that needs to be like conversations that are being had from the top down to the bottom, from bottom to the top. It's just really important to keep sharing these and talking about the needs that is coming up for people. Can you share some non-mainstream self-care practices?
Yes. The first thing I thought of was cooking. Now, let me be honest. I'm kind of tired of washing my own dishes. But that's something I know that a lot of families can do together. That's, again, not necessarily the traditional yoga, smoothie bowl, mainstream things that we've been seeing. Utilizing music, we touched on that a little bit, utilizing music to come together and be together. For a lot of families that are used to spending time together, I know we have definitely been overusing Zoom, but it can be helpful to teach other family members, especially older family members or loved ones, to utilize Zoom so that we can have some collective time together. Those are some other things that you can do. Also, it depends on what feels right for you, but doing your do-it-yourself kind of beauty practices or spa treatments, something as simple as giving yourself a hand massage with hand lotion can be considered self-care and self-soothing. So those are some components too. Creating some new traditions and rituals that you would normally do together, right? Is there a way for you to still have your like Sunday dinners together, if that's something that's important? Is there ways to create art together? Do folks in your family love to sing, love to dance, create some type of music together? Again, those are some different things that are coming up to me that I don't necessarily see in terms of mainstream views of self-care, but they can be really, really helpful.
Yeah, I echo that. I think I've been, I really like doing, like I've been trying to like learn makeup. So me and my friends did like a Zoom call, not a Zoom call, we did like a FaceTime. We all put on did face like makeovers and stuff. And like, we're just like walking through with each other and like what our practices are for one another. Like, oh, I did this, or I did this, and like learning new techniques. So that's just something that like it's just been a fun thing to do for me. And that's something that I enjoy doing, and connecting with that has been really nice as well.
Absolutely.
I think a really great point, not as much of a question, but maybe we can make it a question, Brian shared, was one thing to remind ourselves is how a lot of organizations, like, you started with your yearly goals, or even personally started with some like yearly annual goals that were based on a normal year,
right.
and how this has shifted during this pandemic. And like, what do you think like are some things to share about how people can adjust these both, I think, org-wide goals or personal goals that they might have set for themselves this year?
Man, thank you so much for offering that. I have been using the term grief a lot when talking about things that we had originally planned to do this year, or plan to do for the next 5 years starting this year, and how those plans have to change because the world is changing. And I use the word grief to say we have to cope with the loss of those expectations. And that's not an easy thing to do. That's not a fun thing to do, but it is our reality. And you're not the only one doing it. Hence why I really emphasize communities and organizations coming together to talk to each other about this. One of the issues with dealing with trying to reorganize your original plans for the year is that we do it in silos. And sometimes we have the idea that we're the only ones going through this change. We're the only organization being impacted that way. I just want to shake my head very strongly to say you're not. We are collectively going through this. If we can collectively respond that way, have conversations with each other about this loss, talk about how we feel maybe defeated or disappointed that we have to change our plans, but do it as a community, we can all offer ourselves a little bit more self-compassion around this. And maybe just take a moment to exhale. It's okay if we don't jump to the next venture or the next task right away. Maybe we need a second to kind of just grieve this loss, to talk to our staff about what this loss means. And again, loss is a big word here, because I also know folks have to make really difficult decisions around letting folks go or not having enough money to keep on certain staff members. I call this organizational trauma. Right? And there's definitely a lot of good, really, really good research and things out there on organizational trauma, but a lot of organizations may be feeling that. If we're not acknowledging it, that's really going to cause further harm. So acknowledge it, know that you're not alone in experiencing it. A lot of organizations are experiencing it collectively. Have some compassion, some patience, and grace around thinking about next steps.
I love that. I think that is such an important point. I love this next question. It's kind of something that's been coming up a lot for me, especially as I was writing this post on this. Do you have any other tips for white leaders and nonprofits to be good allies to colleagues of color who are being impacted differently?
Absolutely. The thing that came to my mind first was pause your judgment and remain curious. Curiosity is one of the most powerful components of being an aspiring ally to people experiencing marginalization or oppression. Before jumping to a conclusion, before making an assumption, before assuming you know what you really don't know, try and be curious and be mindful of what questions come up for you. And especially for white leadership who are aspiring to be allies, and I use that word really particular. I learned that from the Women of Color Network. You are an aspiring ally always, because every day you're trying your best to learn what it means to be an ally. You don't just earn allyship with a period at the end, right? It's always work that needs to be done to being an aspiring ally. You want to make sure you're being mindful that there's a lot that you won't know. And that'll be very constant as you continue your aspiring allyship. So try to have some question marks instead of periods when you're checking in with your staff who are a part of communities of color. Offer ways to help, offer ways to be flexible, and ask them, hey, what do you think is best, right? Offer some empowerment there. What do you think is best? What do you think would be helpful? What changes can I do that I have power of and control over that I can change? And again, you're going to get different responses from different staff members. A lot of people who are part of communities of color, not everybody, but a lot of members don't feel that it's safe for them to speak with you in that way. So this is a learned trust that must happen, hence why it's an aspiring allyship. You want to continuously open that door of communication so that folks can talk with you about those important components. But as long as you're keeping in mind, I'm going to pause my judgment and remain curious, I'm telling you, that will take you really, really far.
I love that, Michelle. And I think, like, to make a point that it's not always necessarily just white leaders who need to have allyship. Sometimes it's also the people that are in different, like these different marginalized communities or different, hold different identities, to also be allies to one another, which I think is the intersectionality that comes with allyship as well as the identities we carry. I think it's really important to, like, within our own, within these, like, I as a Latina woman can also, like, do more to, like, pause, like you'd mentioned, suspend judgment and talk to my colleagues who identify differently than I do. And I think that is such an important thing to drive home, is that sometimes it's not just, it's really easy, I think, to just think it's only like white leaders who need to be allies. But I think there's some times where you see there needs to be some other type of allyship towards one another, because the pandemic has really affected communities in similar yet very different ways. Or there's some more like, there's some things that are making the communities understand each other better now as well. So that was just one thing I want to bring up. Somebody else asked, love all these questions. They're great. Hope hope none of them are slipping through the cracks. Sorry if they do, feel free to reach out them. What do we know about restorative human resources? I haven't heard that term before. So
I'll be honest with you, I haven't either. I'm curious about it. I'm familiar with restorative justice, but not restorative human resources. I'll be honest, I'm not familiar with that term.
Okay, I'll leave that. Holly, if you want to do a follow-up, feel free to chat in a follow-up. Somebody, I think, okay, let me see the next one. Person faces. A lot of great chatting. This is apparently, she mentioned it's an emerging practice amongst human resources.
I'm gonna check that out.
Yeah, me too. That probably like really touches a lot on some of these conversations we're having. Does anybody have any other questions that they would like to add? I think I got all the ones. I think I got all the ones that I read through.
Oh, I see one about finding a therapist I can speak to.
Yes, I would love that one. It's from our own fellow Monisha.
Yes, I'm a big fan of Therapy for Black Girls as a directory for finding therapists of color, and asking around. I mean, again, these are kind of like the classic things that you probably already know to do, but having, first of all, if we could try and destigmatize mental health treatment, that would be so helpful. But asking, I know folks will ask me, hey, Michelle, are you familiar with a therapist who's also African-American, who identifies as female? And hey, I'll just get out there and look. But Therapy for Black Girls is one of my favorite networks to find therapists of color. And there's Dr. Joy Harden Bradford has a ton of wonderful resources on there too to help find a therapist. So that's the number one directory for me that I would recommend for finding a mental health professional who's also a part of a community of color.
Great, thank you, Michelle. I think also similarly, Monisha shared with me a new website that's also doing some sharing, especially like therapists around those who are people of color, for people of color, because I think that's something that we have mentioned as a barrier, is sometimes like finding somebody that really can address the lived experiences that people from these identities experience, the traumas that come with being part of those, with being part of that identity as well, really come through. Oh, yep, great. Thank you to those people who are chatting some of those in. Are there any self-care practices you can recommend organizations to do together? Ways to continue, some ways that organizations can help to stay connected. I'll do my little plug after you give your answer.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways. And of course, you got to be tricky with your style, because when leadership tells you to do something, a lot of frontline staff are going, okay, so this is mandatory. So as much as you can, make it voluntary. Whatever practices you choose for organizations to do together, have an option for folks to opt in or opt out, and there won't be consequences. I want to emphasize that in recognizing the power dynamics of doing things as an organization. But there's different like self-care things you can do together. If you're getting on a call and everybody gets to doodle or create some art while you're talking about something non-work related, that's one thing you can do together. I know folks who do like different like dance parties together, or Tai Chi together, some slow movements or guided meditations together, which is really great to like start a meeting or take a break during the meeting. I've also seen organizations that will hire or give access to therapy for their folks on staff. And again, I'd have to look into more detail about kind of the kinks of that, but have an opportunity for folks to have access to therapy that they don't necessarily have to pay for, or that your organization pays for. That's something else that I've seen. leaders offering to have the morning off or have the afternoon off, right? Giving permission for folks to take a break, even if they can't take a break during the entire day, are some other options too. And having experiences like this, where we're learning something together. And of course, learning something that's not work related would be awesome too, and giving the option for folks. And I say the option, really, I emphasize that part, because sometimes folks will think, oh my gosh, if my organization is hosting this self-care piece, that's another thing that I have to do. That may be the translation. So you can say, hey, we're going to have our 1 hour art and talk. I don't know what words you want to use, or if this is time that you can spend doing something else. Create some options around that if you want to do something as an organization together for self-care.
That's great. Thank you so much, Michelle. ProInspire has been doing our weekly self-care hour and a half mostly every Friday, and just taking this time to really like just connect as as friends almost. Like it's not, well, maybe not just friends, but like we're friendly, yeah. And like I would say friends, but you know, not everyone feels that way. But I think it's been really important. And like last time we just like our CEO Manisha sent us all like some at-home face masks to do. So we put our face masks on together. We saw some of the kiddos on the teams, and it was just really like a lovely way. And then one of our other colleagues, Kate, put together some amazing questions to get to know one another better. And it's so funny how like we can work with each other for years, and there's still things that we like get to learn about what, you know, passions that each other has. And I've like really loved that. And I think we're even having, Michelle has an amazing journal book she has created with prompts, and we're ordering those, and we will be working through some of those journaling questions over a few weeks of self-care practices.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, no, it's really exciting. So I think we're kind of nearing the end. I know we had some questions that we didn't get to, and I do apologize for that. And I think so much useful information that you shared with us. So we will be sharing a recording of this. Michelle, we'll have her contact information at the end if you'd like to reach out to Michelle to learn more about her work. So yeah, we can go to the next slide now. So we wanted everyone to wrap up with some of these closing journals. You can choose to write as much or little as you want. One is, what can self-care can you do to address a need you have this week? So I think, as we mentioned with practices, it means looking at what your needs are on a regular basis and understanding that your needs can change. So what's a need that you've seen pop up for you this week, and what can you do to address that need? And what is one thing you're taking away from you today?
Very nice.
Yeah, so we'd love to leave. We can give a few minutes if people want to do that now, and then Michelle can wrap up with her grounding exercise if you have a moment for that.
Yeah.
Also, if you want to open journal, that's also okay. You can feel free to journal this into the chat. We love to hear your chats or your feedback on this, and that's always a great way to see, you know, have share outs.
I'll put a little plug in there. The journal that Ashlyn's referring to is a guided self-care journal that I created when I was working directly with survivors of domestic violence and child abuse. It's called Self-Explore, Self-Restore, and it's about 100 pages of journaling prompts where you can write as a narrative, you can create lists and draw and have maps, whatever feels right in terms of your self-expression. This journal, Self-Explore, Self-Restore, is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And I love to work with organizations around doing the prompts and having like some deeper discussions about the things that come up in the journal. So please feel free, if you know somebody or if you would like to journal more specifically around self-care. The goal is to practice self-care while creating a self-care practice through this journal.
So excited to start that.
Yes. It's a lot of fun to get to know yourself better through this type of journaling.
Oh, yeah. Somebody asked if you can share the link to the journal.
Yeah.
We can screen probably after, like, we can add that, maybe share it to the link.
Yeah, I can stick it in that chat box. I love technology
Oh,
like
yeah. If you
this.
can chat it in, that works well.
Absolutely. And y'all, it's on sale now, $10.99. Very good. We like a discount.
We do love a discount. So great. Well, I wanted to end with a breathing, grounding exercise. Michelle, if you can lead us through that, that'd be great.
Yes. So this is going to be super brief. I normally take a little bit more time for this one. But folks, if you're able to kind of sit up a little bit, sit on your hip bones with your feet flat on the floor. We're going to do a very, very brief gratitude meditation together. If you feel comfortable closing your eyes, please feel free. You're welcome to turn your cameras off if you don't want folks to see you closing your eyes. Do what feels comfortable. I want you to take a really deep breath in, letting in as much air as possible, and letting it out through your mouth so you're making a sound. Do that a couple more times as I'm talking with you, inhaling as much air as you can and letting it out enough through your mouth so that you're making a sound. Now, I love this meditation because it recognizes the parts of you that have to make really tough decisions, that work really hard in your body to make tough decisions. It's your head, your heart, and your gut. These are the parts of our body that get involved when we have to make tough decisions. And I know a lot of folks that are participating in this Lunch and Learn are trying their best to make a lot of tough decisions. So with your dominant hand, I want you to touch the part of your body that you think has been working the hardest lately to help you make those tough decisions. If it's your gut, and that's where our intuition lives, place your dominant hand underneath your stomach and kind of press a little bit so that you feel it. Place your non-dominant hand over your hand and just hold it there to recognize that part of your body. If it's your heart, and again, a lot of caregivers on this particular Lunch and Learn, a lot of folks who really are very caring and make a lot of caring decisions. I want you to place your dominant hand over your heart so that you feel it beating. Press enough so that you feel it beating. Place your non-dominant hand over your heart to cover it and hold it there as you're inhaling and exhaling. And finally, I know a lot of folks are going to relate to this one. If your mind has been at work, you've been overthinking, right? Over-processing, your mind is constantly going. I want you to place your index finger and your middle finger on the sides of your temples and very gently press that part of your body. I want you to recognize that part of your body. And again, you're holding either your gut, your heart, or your mind. And I want you to inhale and exhale 3 times together. Again, inhaling as much air as you can as you're pressing this part of your body and exhaling so that you hear it through your mouth. We are recognizing how much hard work we're doing. We are recognizing that these parts of the body have been working very, very hard. And we're appreciating all the work that these parts of the body have been doing. When you take your last breath, feel free to relax your body a little bit. I like to do a little swivel. That feels good for me. And that's it. That's a really, really brief guided meditation. It helps us slow down. For folks who had their hands over their hearts, did you even feel your heart rate slow down just a little bit?
Yeah.
That's really important. This is what self-care is, y'all. It doesn't take all day, doesn't have to be expensive. You can just use your body as a resource. And part of my plans that have been changed a little bit because of COVID-19 is to create more resources like this to be accessible for everyone. So please feel free to visit my website, gmichelle.com. I'm going to start getting some stuff going so we have way more access to self-care practices like this. I'll stay in touch with the folks at ProInspire. I don't think this will be the first time you'll see me. So we'll continue to talk to each other about what self-care practices we can do so you're taking the best care of yourself.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And I want to echo really appreciate you being able to join us today. I think having your knowledge and amazing passion around these topics really have helped a lot. So I wanted to click on the final slide for those who would like resources or for, there we go, for connecting with Michelle. These are all her handles, her website, her blog website, her Twitter, her Instagram, and Pinterest. And we'll be sharing additional resources along with this webinar after this, along with the link to the journal that Michelle has created. So I want to echo thank you very much for you, and as well as my colleague Kate, who has
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Kate, so much, who has been really working hand on hand with me and Michelle to put this together. So thank you so much to you, to everyone who has joined us. We really are so happy about these conversations that we've had today. And hopefully, you know what, this isn't the end and we can have another one soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Thank you all.